The afternoon sun beat down hard on the quiet suburban neighborhood, its rays glinting off freshly washed SUVs and the pristine windows of houses lined in a row. The streets of Willow Creek were usually calm, the kind of place where neighbors exchanged polite nods and homeowners association notices slipped neatly into mailboxes. But that afternoon, silence gave way to tension. Marcus Kane had been sitting on his front porch, sipping a glass of iced tea, the sweat beading slightly on his forehead. At first glance, he looked like any other middle-aged man enjoying a lazy day off work. Broad shoulders hidden beneath a plain white t-shirt, jeans slightly worn at the knees, boots planted firmly on the wooden porch. But Marcus wasn't ordinary, and if anyone had bothered to look closer, they might have seen the way his sharp eyes scanned his surroundings, or the faint scars on his forearms that hinted at a life lived far from ordinary. For months, Marcus had ignored the ridiculous notices sent by the Willow Creek HOA. Complaints about his lawn not being the exact shade of green approved by the board, accusations that his truck was too loud, or that his American flag hung a fraction too low. He didn't argue or attend their petty meetings. He just lived his life, silently, deliberately. That silence, however, had been taken as defiance. And for people who thrived on control, defiance was dangerous. So when the HOA's enforcement team arrived, they weren't in the mood for compromise. A black SUV rolled up, tinted windows hiding the figures inside. From the porch, Marcus watched without expression as the vehicle stopped in front of his driveway. 4 men stepped out, each wearing dark tactical pants and cheap black shirts with HOA security patches sewn clumsily onto the sleeves. Their belts were weighed down with plastic-looking badges, handcuffs, and batons that were more for show than function. But each man carried himself with the swagger of authority borrowed, not earned. The leader, a bulky man with a shaved head and mirrored sunglasses, barked an order as though commanding real officers. "Mr. Kane, you are in violation of multiple HOA codes and have failed to comply with repeated warnings. By the authority vested in the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, we are placing you under arrest." Marcus leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of tea. The ice clinked softly against the glass. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. His stillness unnerved the men who had expected him to argue or protest. "Did you hear me?" the leader demanded, stepping closer. His boots crunched on the gravel of Marcus's driveway. "You're coming with us, now." Inside Marcus's chest, a memory stirred, a briefing room deep inside a Navy base, a commander's voice reminding him of the importance of patience, observation, and precision. He remembered the weight of the combat gear he'd once worn, the feel of a rifle snug against his shoulder, the silence before an operation went loud. He had been many things in his life: protector, hunter, ghost. The men in front of him had no idea. Marcus finally set his glass down on the porch railing and spoke, his voice calm and even. "You boys aren't cops, and this isn't how the law works." The leader sneered. "We have authority here. The HOA rules are binding. You don't follow them, you face consequences." He signaled to the others. 2 of them started up the porch steps, their hands resting on their batons. The neighbors began to peek from behind curtains and blinds, the kind of crowd that thrived on gossip but was too cowardly to intervene. To them, it looked like a man about to be humbled, another, troublemaker, about to learn that no one resisted Willow Creek's iron-fisted HOA. Marcus stood, slowly, stretching his tall frame, his movements fluid and deliberate. He wasn't rushing, wasn't panicked. He had faced far worse than this: ambushes in foreign deserts, night raids in hostile cities, close quarters combat where a single hesitation meant death. These men, they were children playing dress up. "Last chance," Marcus said, his voice dropping lower, edged with steel. "Turn around. Get back in your truck. Leave." The leader laughed, pulling a pair of zip-tie cuffs from his belt. "Or what? You gonna call the cops on us?" "Don't think so, Kane. Out here, we are the law." The other 2 reached the top step, their bodies angled in what they thought was an intimidating stance. But Marcus saw every flaw. The way one man's weight leaned too far forward, the way the other gripped his baton too tight, telegraphing inexperience. Marcus moved before they even knew it. His hand shot out, gripping the wrist of the first man and twisting it sharply. The baton clattered to the porch as the man yelped in pain. In the same motion, Marcus pivoted, using his own momentum to drive his elbow into the second man's chest. The air left the thug in a rush, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping. It had taken less than 3 seconds. The neighbors gasped behind their windows. The leader froze, stunned that his arrest had unraveled so quickly. Marcus turned his gaze on him, his eyes cold, unyielding. "You think this is a game," Marcus said quietly, stepping down from the porch. "But men like me don't play games." For a flicker of a moment, the leader hesitated. Something about the way Marcus carried himself, the precision, the deadly calm, stirred a primal recognition of danger. But pride overruled instinct, and he barked another order, waving for the last man to step forward. Marcus sighed. Wrong move. The last man charged, swinging his baton wildly. Marcus sidestepped, caught the man's arm, and with a swift motion, disarmed him and flipped him onto the grass. The thud echoed through the street. The leader stumbled backward, his sunglasses slipping down his nose. His confidence drained, leaving only fear. What the hell are you? Marcus's eyes locked on him. Memories of his years in the Navy SEALs, missions buried in secrecy, men who had called him brother, enemies who had learned his name in whispered fear, flooded his mind. He hadn't wanted this part of his life to surface again. But sometimes, silence wasn't enough. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," Marcus said, his voice low, almost a growl. The leader's mouth went dry. He had walked into this man's home thinking it would be an easy show of power, but instead, he had awakened something he couldn't comprehend. Something lethal. Marcus stepped closer, each stride measured, his presence towering. "Now I'm going to say this once. Leave this property. Don't come back. Tell your little HOA board if they want to play cops, they better find someone else to intimidate." The leader's bravado evaporated. He stumbled toward the SUV, fumbling with his keys, motioning for his injured men to get up. The defeated group scrambled back into their vehicle, slamming the doors shut as the engine roared to life. Marcus stood in the driveway, arms crossed, watching them flee. The SUV screeched down the street, leaving only silence behind. Curtains quickly snapped shut, neighbors pretending they hadn't seen anything. Marcus exhaled slowly, picking up his glass of tea again. The ice had melted, but he didn't care. He took a sip, sat back down, and stared at the horizon. He had tried to leave that life behind. The life of a warrior, a Navy SEAL, the man they once called Ghost. But the HOA had made a mistake. They thought they could control him with rules and intimidation. What they didn't know was that Marcus Kane wasn't a man to be controlled. And this was just the beginning. The black SUV sped out of Willow Creek like a wounded animal, its tires screeching around the bend until it disappeared down the main road. For a moment, peace returned. Marcus Kane sat on his porch, silent, his glass of tea now lukewarm in his hand. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't end there. Men like the ones he had just dismantled, weak, puffed-up bullies, rarely admitted defeat. They would return, and next time, they'd bring something worse. He didn't care about the HOA's petty grievances. It wasn't about the length of his grass, the sound of his truck, or the flag on his porch. It was about control, and he had just broken their illusion of power in front of the entire neighborhood. That was something they couldn't forgive. Marcus leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, letting the warm breeze carry memories from another life. Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, shadows of battles fought in deserts and mountains. He'd been trained to fight wars most men couldn't imagine, to dismantle threats before they bloomed into chaos. He had promised himself those days were behind him. But war had a way of finding men like him. 2 houses down, Mrs. Patterson peeked nervously through her blinds. She had been on the HOA board for 10 years, and though she wasn't among the enforcers who had shown up, she had pushed hardest for action against Marcus. Now her hands trembled. She had seen the ease with which he had dispatched their so-called security. The man was dangerous, more dangerous than she had ever guessed. And that meant the board would have to escalate. By nightfall, the HOA president, Gerald Whitmore, sat at the head of a long oak table inside the clubhouse, his face red with fury. He was a man who lived for authority, the kind who treated neighborhood rules like sacred scripture. To him, Marcus's defiance wasn't just rebellion, it was a public humiliation. "We can't let this stand," Gerald barked, slamming his fist on the table. Around him, board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. That man attacked our security team in broad daylight. If word gets out that the HOA has no power, this entire community will fall apart. Maybe we overstepped, one of the women murmured. They're not real police, Gerald. People will start asking questions. Gerald leaned forward, his eyes blazing. We are the authority here. And if Kane thinks he can ignore us, he's dead wrong. I've already made some calls. Tomorrow, we'll deal with him properly. The room fell silent. Everyone knew Gerald's temper could drive him to reckless lengths. But none dared oppose him outright. The following day, Marcus was in his garage, tightening bolts on his old Chevy pickup, when he heard the sound. Not the low rumble of one engine, but several. Tires grinding against asphalt, doors slamming, voices barking orders. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped into the sunlight, his jaw tightening at the sight before him. 5 SUVs lined the street in front of his house, each one stuffed with more men in tactical gear. But these weren't the same cheap imposters from yesterday. Their uniforms were more polished, their gear sharper. Their leader carried himself with military precision. But Marcus didn't miss the details. Their holsters carried only tasers, not firearms. Their patches bore no official insignia. They were still fakes, just better funded ones. The neighbors gathered again, whispering nervously from behind their fences and curtains. Some filmed on their phones, drawn to the spectacle. To them, it was almost entertainment. Another HOA drama played out in the open. But Marcus felt the shift in the air. This wasn't theater anymore. This was escalation. The leader of the squad stepped forward, a tall man with a scar running across his cheek. Marcus Kane, he called out, his voice booming with rehearsed authority. By order of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, you are hereby under arrest for assaulting security officers and violating multiple HOA ordinances. Surrender now, or we'll be forced to detain you. Marcus didn't move. He simply studied the man's stance, the way his eyes darted nervously despite his commanding tone. The scarred man wasn't a soldier. He was an actor, a thug dressed in borrowed intimidation. You're trespassing, Marcus said flatly, his voice carrying across the lawn. You step onto my property, and you'll regret it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The scarred man smirked, waving his hand. Men, move in. The squad advanced, boots pounding the pavement, their formation clumsy but threatening. Marcus exhaled slowly. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted to bring back the man he used to be. But when they crossed onto his property, something inside him snapped into place. The ghost had returned. With surgical precision, Marcus grabbed the nearest object, a wrench from the open toolbox, and hurled it at the lead man's hand. The taser flew from his grip, clattering across the driveway. Before the others could react, Marcus closed the distance. A sharp knee drove into one man's stomach, dropping him instantly. He spun, grabbed another by the collar, and slammed him against the SUV, his body crumpling with the impact. It was chaos. Batons swung wildly, tasers sparked in the air, but Marcus moved like a shadow. Every motion was calculated, every strike efficient. He wasn't fighting to show off. He was fighting the way he had been trained, fast, brutal, decisive. Within minutes, the so-called squad lay scattered across his lawn, groaning, clutching at bruises and twisted joints. The scarred leader stood frozen, his face pale. He had underestimated this man. Badly. Marcus advanced, his eyes locked on the trembling figure. Tell Gerald Whitmore, he said, his voice like steel, that if he sends more of you here, I won't hold back next time. The scarred man stumbled backward, nodding frantically before scrambling into his SUV. The rest of the battered squad followed, dragging themselves inside. Engines roared, tires squealed, and within moments, the convoy vanished down the street, leaving only the whispers of stunned neighbors in its wake. Silence fell again. Marcus stood alone in his driveway, chest rising and falling with steady control. His gaze drifted toward the houses around him, where fearful eyes stared back. He knew what they were thinking. Who was this man? What kind of neighbor could dismantle an entire squad like it was nothing? Marcus turned back toward his house, his boots crunching against the gravel. He picked up his wrench, set it back in the toolbox, and closed the lid with a firm snap. But even as he walked inside, he knew this wasn't over. The wall wouldn't stop. Gerald Whitmore's pride wouldn't allow it. Inside his living room, Marcus sat down heavily on the couch. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of inevitability. He had tried to live quietly, to disappear into normal life. But the world had a way of dragging him back. And now, thanks to a handful of arrogant board members, the ghost was awake again. Far across town, in the comfort of the HOA clubhouse, Gerald Whitmore seethed as he listened to the scarred man's report. His face turned purple with rage. 2 squads, taken down by 1 man. The scarred man nodded, his voice trembling. He's not normal, sir. He fights like he's trained. Military, maybe, special forces. Gerald's jaw tightened. His pride wouldn't let him accept defeat. Then we'll find out exactly who Marcus Kane really is. And when we do, we'll bury him. But what Gerald didn't know was that Marcus's name was already legend in certain circles. Among enemies overseas, he had been a nightmare whispered in dark corners. Among allies, he had been the man they called when failure wasn't an option. The HOA thought they were fighting a stubborn homeowner. They didn't realize they had declared war on a Navy SEAL. And this time, the battlefield was his own backyard.